This is Hazmit, Jack, and I's second presentation on the Indian caste system and Dalits. In this presentation, we're going to build on our first presentation, which outlined the harms faced by Dalits in India. We're going to focus on social structures and how they influence these harms and how they're propagated through Indian society. For this project, we are using Jonathan Eastwood's definition of social structures. Social structures are rules, relationships, and representations that have been sustained over time, are difficult to change, and can both expand or limit the range of possible opportunities for an individual. Our choices are both impacted by these structures, and our choices impact the structures themselves. In the following slides, we will delve deeper into the ways in which rules, representations, and relationships manifest in Indian society to constrain the choices of Dalits. Especially important are societal rules, which are mostly informal since discrimination on the basis of caste was outlawed with constitutional reform in 1947. As well, entrenched representations of each caste in society, as well as intra-caste and inter-caste relationships contribute to hostility and competition in a negative sense here, between castes. And social and economic relationships, which are vastly different depending on the caste of the participating parties, result in Dalit exclusion, humiliation, and violence.
While the practice of untouchability was technically outlawed in 1950 upon the adoption of the Indian Constitution, there are still several societal norms that remain intact that harm the Dalits. First is the prohibition of inter-caste relationships. Again, while the Special Marriage Act of 1954 allowed individuals of different castes to marry, socially this is not a practice that is accepted. People who choose to marry outside of their own caste are often ostracized from their families and communities and even face violent crimes as a result of their decisions. This makes social mobility extremely difficult for the Dalits. Dalits are also commonly banned from many temples and religious sites, especially in rural areas in India, due to their quote-unquote impurity. Even in temples where Dalits are allowed, in many cases, they will have separate worship areas so as not to taint the religious space. And the last one I'll mention is the occupational distribution of Dalits. As we mentioned in the last video, there are systems and laws in place to increase the Dalit representation in education and government, but these laws are largely unenforced, leaving Dalits to work the typically menial, unsanitary, and labor-intensive jobs.
Caste-based relationships shape nearly every aspect of Dalits' lives. Social interactions are dictated by caste hierarchies, meaning upper castes often refuse to eat, marry, or even socialize with Dalits. Inter-caste marriage is heavily discouraged, and in some cases leading to honor killings or social ostracizations. This isolation extends to employment and education, where Dalits lack access to the networks and connections needed for upward mobility. Fear of retaliation keeps many Dalits silent, and speaking out against discrimination often leads to violent consequences. And these relationships don't just reinforce inequality, they actively maintain the caste system. Dalits are trapped in economic relationships that reinforce their oppression. First, caste dictates job roles. Dalits are forced into low-paying, high-risk jobs with little chance of promotion due to this caste bias. Secondly, hiring decisions are made through caste networks, meaning even highly educated Dalits struggle to get hired in professional fields. And lastly, debt traps and bonded labor ensure that Dalits remain financially dependent and unable to escape poverty. These economic structures keep discrimination alive in India, preventing Dalits from achieving real upward mobility. And from a personal example, when I was in India this past December, I saw these people and these individuals looking for work and unable to maintain it and achieve it.
Representations of caste identity are deeply entrenched in Indian society. Relationships between castes are often hostile, even violent when change is occurring. With constitutional reform, legal changes, and affirmative action, the level of inequality between castes has lessened since the early 20th century. Yet caste is still a distinct, definable trait for each Indian. Caste hierarchy, broadly, has not changed in its ordering since then. Caste isn't just a historical relic. It can become more rigid and violent when hierarchy is challenged. 2 massacres occurred in Karamdechu, a village in India's Andhra Pradesh province in the southeast of the country, in 1985 and 1991. These incidents had 6 and 8 fatalities, respectively. In Karamdechu, the Kamas were a landowning peasant class who had risen to economic and political power through agricultural wealth and later corporate success. Despite this, they still saw Dalits as a threat whenever they displayed even small acts of defiance. For example, Dalits in Karamdechu started showing more confidence in public spaces, they stopped giving up their bus seats to Kamas, they demanded fair treatment, and they resisted the forced submissiveness expected of them. But instead of recognizing this as progress, the dominant caste, which was still previously a peasant landowning class, reacted with extreme violence. The first massacre was triggered by a seemingly minor act of defiance, a Dalit boy scolding a Kama boy for washing his buffalo in a shared water tank. This led to an organized attack by Kama landlords, in which Dalit homes were burned, men were killed, women and children were brutalized. So rather than fading away, it became an active tool for suppressing Dalits and maintaining the social order. The massacre in Karamdechu was not about revenge. It was a deliberate attempt to terrorize Dalits into submission, ensuring that their social and economic rise would be crushed before it could gain momentum.